Good afternoon or good morning, and thank you for joining us for the latest installment in the AFRY webinar series. My name is Claire Behrens, and I'll be the moderator of today's session. Today's webinar is entitled PJM and the Impact of Pennsylvania's Carbon Pricing. And for those of you who don't know, PJM is one of the largest power markets in the United States, covering 13 states and the District of Columbia. And it covers a population of 65 million. So it's quite a significant market in the United States. Several of the states in PJM are part of a regional voluntary carbon pricing initiative that we call RGGI or RGGI. And Pennsylvania is the latest state to consider joining. And this is quite an event. And as a result, this webinar will look at the impacts of this action by Pennsylvania on the broader PJM market. Next slide. So we skipped over the normal disclaimer that we have to show, and I will now go over our presenters today. As I said, my name is Claire Behrens. I'm a principal with AFRY. I'm located in the Boston area, and I cover the broader US Northeast markets.
Hello, I'm Ingolf Dorn. I'm the market lead for PJM, and I've been with AFRY since 2011. I'm a principal in our London offices, and I've been working on modeling this market since 2015 and been quite active on transactions in PJM covering either renewable assets or thermal assets. And it's been a very exciting market from my perspective to model.
Hi, hello, I'm Filipe. I'm a consultant in the AFRY's Oxford UK office. I'm the lead modeler for PJM. Like Ingolf, I was part of the original team that started the backcast of PJM, and it's been my main market for the last years. So it's quite interesting to be here.
Great. Before we start, I'm just going to take care of a few housekeeping items. First of all, please feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar. There is a question panel on your computer that you can type when a question you have. In addition, we did have people who asked questions at registration, and we'll try to get to those as well. We are planning this to be a 45-minute webinar. We could go over, so I hope people do stay on if we go a little bit over, because we do hope to both go through the content as well as some of the questions. And lastly, the slide pack and the recording will be emailed to all attendees as soon as it's available. Without further ado, Ingolf, would you like to start the presentation?
Yeah, I'd love to do so. So I can remember when we started modeling PJM a few years ago, carbon pricing wasn't much of an issue. Only generators in Maryland and Delaware faced a carbon price covering less than 10% of PJM's installed fossil fuel generation capacity. Since then, New Jersey and Virginia have introduced pricing, and Pennsylvania is now taking steps to do so from 2022. As a result, more than 50% of PJM's existing fossil fuel fleet may face a carbon price in just over a year's time. Today's webinar is for all of us interested in understanding the expected impact Pennsylvania joining the RGGI would have on supply-side dynamics in the state and in the wider PJM footprint. We have modeled a sensitivity to assess this. The main changes we found compared to our mid-2020 central view, in which Pennsylvania does not join the initiative, are worsened economics for new gas capacity in Pennsylvania, leading to a shift of gas new build out to more western parts of PJM, a reduction in coal retirals in the short term to compensate for lower gas new build in Pennsylvania, but faster overall coal retirals over time. We've also seen increased solar PV build in RGGI states, driving up the size of PJM's total solar PV fleet, and faster CO2 emissions reductions in the RGGI region, but carbon leakage from states outside RGGI becoming a major issue. Therefore, overall CO2 emissions across PJM remain at similar levels compared to a centrist scenario. This here gives you a bit of an overview of what we will cover today. We will provide a short intro to RGGI for those not familiar with it, and discuss Pennsylvania's journey to joining the initiative. We will outline what makes Pennsylvania special compared to the existing RGGI member states and look at the implied changes to fossil fuel economics from Pennsylvania joining the initiative. We will show how a future with carbon pricing in Pennsylvania may differ from A3's standard central scenario outlook for PJM and summarize our main conclusions before answering your questions in the Q&A. Let us start off with testing you as our audience and testing your understanding of the PJM markets. So we'd like to get your opinion on whether you think PJM states coordinate their power sector policies, don't coordinate them, but that state policies are largely aligned, or whether the states have implemented widely varying policies in line with state-specific needs. So please click on the answer that you agree with in the poll. So I can see the numbers increasing, and I would say we have there's still some numbers coming in, but I think it's largely stabilized. So we'll close the poll now and share the results. Most of you have answered C. PJM states have implemented widely varying policies in line with their state-specific needs. And as you can see from the next slide, that was the right answer to pick. Across the 13 member states and the District of Columbia, PJM is a patchwork of varying state-level policies driven by state-level political views, access to natural resources, which are a key driver of the capacity mix, and the relative strength of industrial or environmental lobbies. And this divergence or diversity of policy and policy ambition across the member states makes this a very exciting but also a very challenging market to model. Now let's have a bit of a look at carbon pricing in the US with a focus on RGTI. In 2009, the Obama administration worked on introducing a federal emission trading system that would have put a price on carbon emissions across all US states. While the initiative brought a bill through the House of Representatives, it was never introduced to the Senate for discussion. Since then, we've seen a lack of federal leadership on carbon pricing in the US. To fill this void, 10 northeastern states got together in 2009 and founded RGGI, making it the first mandatory market-based greenhouse gas emissions reductions mechanism in the US. The original founder states are shown in blue-gray on the map on the left-hand sides. 3 of those states are PJM member states, namely Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey. Over the years, New Jersey left the initiative in 2011 as the Republicans took hold of the state, but it rejoined in 2020, and Virginia will join in 2021, with Pennsylvania looking to join in 2022. As you can see, we've outlined the footprint of RGGI that is within PJM with a red line. So you can see that now 5 member states are part of PJM, 5 PJM member states are part of RGGI. Some quick facts about RGGI, which might be useful for our European listeners, as RGGI is quite different from the EU ETS. The initiative only covers power sector emissions from owners of generation of more than 25 megawatts. It caps annual emissions across member states and reduces the cap by around 2.5% each year. Proceeds from the program from the sale of allowances are reinvested in energy efficiency and in renewable energy deployment programs. So there's a bit of a double benefit in terms of transitioning to carbon-free generation. Between 2009 and 2017, just under $5 billion were allocated for reinvestment in such initiatives from the sale of RGGI allowances. In terms of the success of the initiative in reducing CO2 emissions, we've seen that since 2009, CO2 emissions from power plants in RGGI states have fallen by over 50%. Pennsylvania's journey towards RGGI has started with the state's Democratic Governor Tom Wolf signing an executive order setting the first statewide greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals in 2019 and deciding that joining RGGI was needed to realize these targets. In terms of ambition, these targets are similar to those of other East Coast US states, looking for a reduction in emissions of 26% below 2005 levels by 2025 and 80% below 2005 levels by 2050. As you can see on the slide, this has been a very curvy road with lots of obstacles and opportunities for the initiative to fall off the cliff along the way. It's been a highly political process with lots of arguments from different political, industrial, and environmental interests in favor and against joining RGGI. What's made the process so difficult compared to other RGGI member states was that the opposition from the legislative, with both the Pennsylvania House and Senate being dominated by the Republicans, who fiercely opposed the state joining RGGI. Bills trying to block the governor's initiative, in particular House Bill 2025 for those who followed the developments, were drafted and passed the House and Senate with huge margins, even with support from some Democrats. However, those margins weren't high enough to make those bills veto-proof. Therefore, Governor Wolf was able to veto the bills and push ahead with the initiative of joining RGGI, despite the opposition from Republicans. And Pennsylvania is now on track for joining RGGI, with draft rulemaking open for public comment since the start of November, and hearings to be held by mid-December. While we would expect further legal challenges between now and 2022, we believe it is now highly likely that Pennsylvania will join RGGI at that time. So what makes Pennsylvania special compared to other existing RGGI member states? And again, we would like to ask for your opinion on this. The question here is whether what makes Pennsylvania different is that it's already a leader in renewable energy deployment with lots of renewables on the ground, or whether it is a fossil fuel powerhouse. Please give us your answers. So I'm going to give you a little bit more time to answer this. And I'm going to close this right now and share the results with you. As you can see, the vast majority has said that Pennsylvania is a fossil fuel powerhouse. And as you can see from the impressive statistics on this slide here, that answer was 100% correct. So this slide here shows you the statistics. I just had to hide the poll. So Pennsylvania is a real fossil fuel powerhouse, both within PJM, but also US-wide. It's the first real major fossil fuel power generator and exporter of fossil fuels to join a carbon pricing initiative. And it's really impressive in that a state like Pennsylvania is taking such a step. You may ask, what are the implied changes from Pennsylvania joining RGGI? One of the major changes from Pennsylvania joining RGGI is the proportion of PJM's fossil fuel fired generation fleet that is exposed to carbon pricing. Before Pennsylvania joins RGGI, around 30% of the RTO's gas and coal-fired generation fleet faces a carbon price. With Pennsylvania becoming a member of RGGI, an additional 35 gigawatts of gas and coal-fired capacity move into RGGI in 2022. As a result, more than 50% of the RTO's gas and coal-fired generation fleet will be exposed to the RGGI carbon price at that point in time. I'm now handing over to my colleague Filipe to talk you through how Pennsylvania joining RGGI impacts the carbon price required to achieve RGGI emissions reduction targets and the resulting changes to generation economics of gas and coal generators in Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Ingolf. Now, this amount of thermal generation metaphorically crossing the border will have a visible impact on the way RGGI's emissions reduction targets can be achieved. Let me walk you through this, starting with the chart on the left. The blue line shows Pennsylvania total unabated emissions, which are emissions that are not matched by RGGI emissions allowances. Now, this is assuming a business as usual path, meaning that we are showing the evolution of Pennsylvania's emissions if no capacity or generation in Pennsylvania were affected by a RGGI carbon price. This is then compared against an increasingly smaller cap, estimated using the existing RGGI rules. As you can see by looking at the chart and following the negative blue line, this means that there is a deficit of allowances compared to Pennsylvania's total thermal emissions. Let's look at the orange lines on the chart. The dashed orange line represents the annual balance of RGGI without Pennsylvania. As you can see, it's net positive until roughly 2035, indicating a surplus of allowances, moving then into a deficit from roughly 2035 onwards. Now, the solid orange line represents RGGI with Pennsylvania. With the addition of Pennsylvania, the previous picture is now changed. RGGI's initial surplus now runs out before 2030, and RGGI's annual imbalance by 2050 is now 5 times larger. As mentioned earlier, this is the trajectory for RGGI, assuming that there is no change of pace regarding Pennsylvania futures emissions. Clearly, this emissions imbalance would have to be corrected by a RGGI price increase. This would make emissions more expensive and therefore creating an incentive for the emissions reduction that RGGI aims for. This way, it's not only the generators in Pennsylvania that are affected and need to reduce their emissions, but all generators in 12-state RGGI markets. Now, this price increase is what we are showing on the chart on the right. The lower line on the chart shows the price trajectory in our central scenario. The upper line shows one potential RGGI carbon price trajectory that assure RGGI's target of emission reduction could be reached. As you can see, this presents a material increase of the prices used in our central scenario. So how will this affect different types of fossil fuel generation? Ingolf, could you show the next slide, please? Perfect, thank you. Now, this slide shows a comparison of a generic gas CCGT in Pennsylvania versus a coal unit in Pennsylvania in the year 2022. Now, we can see immediately that the impact of carbon pricing is smaller for the gas unit than for the coal one. The reason the gas CCGT is impacted less is it has a higher thermal efficiency or heat rate versus the coal unit, and gas has a lower carbon content per fuel unit compared to coal. As a result of this, while a gas unit in RGGI by 2022 would see its short-run marginal cost increase by $4, a competing coal unit, already starting from a less favorable position, would suffer an increase of $10. Now, the impact of this change means that Pennsylvania gas generators lose some of their competitive edge from cheap gas prices against gas-fired generators outside of RGGI states, and that Pennsylvania's coal fleet becomes less economic compared to coal-fired generators outside RGGI, turning some of the previously most economic coal plants in PJM into candidates for retirement. Ingolf, would you like to take it over from here?
So in addition to the fossil fuel plant dynamics Filipe has just discussed, when we designed the sensitivity, we expected that one way PJM would react to Pennsylvania joining RGGI would be via more renewable and battery build-out in the RGGI states. This is an option that is supportive of higher renewable ambition in Eastern PJM and state mandates for battery build. We expected that this would lead to regional disparities in wholesale electricity and capacity prices between RGGI and non-RGGI member states. We believe that PJM would aim to alleviate such regional disparities by building more interconnection, in particular as the price differentials would make internal interconnection more economic. We have therefore reinforced one of the more constrained interconnectors that connects RGGI states with non-RGGI states to allow for flows in both ways and to reduce those price differentials that we expected would come up to kind of mitigate that impact of splitting PJM into two very, very different systems. Now we come on to the centerpiece of the webinar, the discussion of our sensitivity modeling results. We will discuss the results in 4 dimensions: the impact on the investment case for gas new build, the decommissioning of existing coal capacity, the build-out of solar PV and battery capacity, and the changes to CO2 emissions that result from Pennsylvania joining RGGI. When we present the results in these 4 dimensions, we report them in terms of the change on our central scenario, and it's very important that you bear that point in mind, that it's basically the divergence from our modeling results in the central that we will be talking about. So how does the sensitivity look different compared to our central scenario? And we will do so reporting these differentials separately for non-RGGI member states and for RGGI member states. My colleague Filipe will introduce the central scenario baseline for comparison in each of these dimensions and take you through the sensitivity modeling results now.
Thank you, Ingolf. Let's start the results section by giving you a brief overlook of PJM's capacity mix by 2040 in our central scenario. For the purpose of this comparison, we are including Pennsylvania into the RGGI state, hence the shaded pattern of Pennsylvania in the map. This way, we can compare modeling results geographically on a like-for-like basis. Also important to flag that as a convention, whenever I say RGGI states, I mean the RGGI states in PJM and not talking about New York or New England. Starting with gas capacity, we can see that by 2040, we have an even split of gas CCGT capacity in RGGI and non-RGGI states. New build is mostly outside of RGGI states, with some new build in RGGI states being mostly in Pennsylvania. Regarding coal, we can see the scale of decommissionings in and out of RGGI, leaving the entirety of PJM with just 19 gigawatts of operating coal capacity, and mostly outside of RGGI. The remaining 1 gigawatt of coal that stayed online in RGGI is in Pennsylvania. In our central, by 2040, even without a carbon price in Pennsylvania, we already expected that most coal units in that state would be decommissioned. Renewables are built across PJM, but mostly in RGGI states. Despite PJM remaining mostly a thermal system, we see strong solar growth due to A, state renewable portfolio standards, and B, rapidly falling technology costs. We project batteries being built only inside RGGI states, following the increased renewable penetration in these areas. Let's have a look on how gas capacity is compared to our central. Thank you. Here we are showing 2 points on the timeline, 2025 representing the short term and 2040 representing the long term. In the short term, outside of RGGI, we see no change as conditions for gas have not materially changed. Inside RGGI, in the short term, there is a small reduction of gas capacity as we expect that some Pennsylvania projects in planning but not under construction would be abandoned. This would happen due to unfavorable conditions that gas generators with an added carbon cost would face. In the long term, inside RGGI, we see again a reduction in gas capacity. This is due to unfavorable conditions that gas generators with an added carbon cost will face versus other non-RGGI generators. Outside of RGGI, by 2040, we see an additional 3.5 gigawatts of new gas capacity coming online. This happens not only due to the absence of competing capacity in RGGI, but also due to the favorable conditions a gas generator outside of RGGI now faces, with an increased east-west interconnection allowing more power export into RGGI states, and carbon pricing raising the wholesale price in RGGI states, new gas built on the non-RGGI states that do not have carbon pricing become economically more attractive. Therefore, we see a move west of the new gas builds. Let's continue by having a look at coal capacity. Thank you. For coal, in the short term and inside RGGI, we see an additional 2.5 gigawatts of coal exiting the system. This is the combination of coal capacity being taken offline earlier due to increased carbon costs and an additional 1 gigawatt in Pennsylvania that would now be decommissioned compared to our central. Outside of RGGI, in the short term, we see an increase of 4 gigawatts of the amount of coal that remains online. There are 3 main reasons for this. Higher coal retirals in the RGGI states, less gas built in RGGI states as we have just seen due to increased generation costs, and higher wholesale prices across RGGI states, increasing the revenue captured by coal plants outside of RGGI. In the long term, outside of RGGI, an additional 2.5 gigawatts of coal exit the system. This is a result of the increased competitiveness of new gas outside RGGI, as it benefits from the increased interconnection east-west and the possibility of exporting into RGGI's higher power prices. New gas becomes more profitable, underbids the existing coal units in the capacity market, and forces them out of the system. In the RGGI states, long term, most coal capacity is closed by 2030. The 1 gigawatt reduction we see by 2040 compared to our central scenario is effectively additional Pennsylvania units closing. Let's have a look at renewables now. Thank you. We had some interesting questions coming in ahead of the webinar. One of them was around the impact on renewable economics in Eastern PJM, and this slide addresses the question nicely. Here, we will only compare the long-term impacts of Pennsylvania joining RGGI, as on the short term, differences are negligible. In the long term, solar PV sees a positive impact from Pennsylvania joining RGGI, with an increase of the installed capacity of 6.5 gigawatts, with a higher wholesale price being set mostly by fossil fuel thermal plants that face the carbon price, and with those higher carbon costs reducing the thermal capacity in RGGI, the investment case for renewables in RGGI states improves. For batteries, the story is slightly more negative compared to the central, but still at very similar levels. The main function of batteries on the system is security of supply, arbitraging between high generation, low-priced hours and high demand, high-priced hours. So now, with an increased East-West interconnection providing part of the security of supply, within-day price variation is reduced. This creates less space for battery storage to capture the arbitrage value. Therefore, we see a small reduction versus our central. And let's move over to the emissions results. So I will start by giving you a brief overview of our mid-2020 central scenario regarding emissions. As previously, we have incorporated Pennsylvania into the RGGI states, despite not being within RGGI in our central scenario. You can see Pennsylvania's emissions on the dark blue section of the RGGI states emissions chart. As you can see, Pennsylvania's emissions are roughly at the same level from 2025 to 2040. This indicates mainly a stable thermal capacity mix. The remaining RGGI states see their emissions reduced throughout the 2020-2040 period, with increasing generation costs for fossil fuel thermal capacity driving the reduction. The necessary new build for these states is mostly renewables and batteries, and this is then conjugated with increased thermal new build on the non-RGGI states, therefore reducing RGGI's emissions. For the non-RGGI states, as we have just implied, emissions rise throughout the 2020-2040 period, following the increase of gas thermal capacity and generation. This increase of fossil fuel thermal generation is based on two factors. It is replacing some of the lost generation in RGGI states. This generation block has effectively moved west, exiting RGGI and carbon pricing, and it reflects PJM's growing demand, which must be met by a combination of new gas capacity and renewables. And let's continue by seeing how Pennsylvania joining RGGI has impacted these emissions. When you look at RGGI as expected, we can see an overall emissions reductions throughout the entire period versus our central. This reflects not only earlier and additional coal closures, but also the withdrawal of new gas builds in Pennsylvania, short and long term, and a lower fossil fuel thermal utilization. On the non-RGGI states, however, throughout the entire period, we see a significant increase in emissions, counterbalancing the RGGI states reduction. With the increase in East-West interconnection, this creates a larger number of hours per the year where RGGI states can be supplied by non-RGGI fossil fuel thermal capacity. Effectively, the East-West interconnection facilitates carbon leakage within PJM, moving additional emissions from RGGI states into non-RGGI states. In the short term, this benefits additional coal units that remain open in non-RGGI states, therefore helping to counterbalance the reduction in thermal capacity in the RGGI states. On the long term, it benefits new build from gas generators that now experience improved economics from supplying their power directly into RGGI states without facing the additional carbon costs. When we look at the results, we were somewhat surprised to see that by 2040, total emissions from PJM were not significantly reduced compared to our central. When we look into detail, it is clear that the higher carbon price in RGGI will improve the economics of carbon leakage by creating a larger price differential between RGGI and non-RGGI states. Therefore, it will be quite difficult for PJM as a whole to reduce its total emissions without Western states setting emissions reduction targets. And I shall now hand over to Ingolf for the final conclusions.
Thank you, Filipe, for talking us through these fascinating modeling results. So to summarize, the key results that we found when comparing the future with carbon pricing in Pennsylvania to our central scenario outlook are: investors in gas-fired generation need to look to more western parts of PJM outside RGGI to develop new plants that are economic. Coal is needed in the short term as Pennsylvania faces a reduction of investment of new gas capacity in the short term. However, overall we see more coal retiring over time. The investment case for solar PV looks materially stronger in RGGI states compared to a central scenario, and CO2 emissions shift west, with carbon leakage becoming a major issue. PJM-wide emissions do not decrease materially compared to a central scenario as western states don't decarbonize. We hope you found this webinar as exciting as we have found the modeling of Pennsylvania joining RGGI. This has been a really interesting process for us. And just to let you know that there are lots more fascinating modeling results from the analysis that we could talk you through on a one-to-one basis. These include more detail on the impact on wholesale prices and regional divergence of these, the impact on the capacity prices, where to develop or buy your next project and which technology would fit your investment portfolio, the potential impact on gas demand, and the future evolution of gas prices that changes as Pennsylvania joins RGGI. We can also run additional scenarios and sensitivities on our PJM central scenario, testing the impact of future changes that you are particularly concerned about. Now I'll hand over to Claire for the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Ingolf and Filipe, for the very thorough analysis of potential impacts of Pennsylvania joining the RGGI program. And as you mentioned, there are quite a number of interesting issues regarding this impact on the market, and certainly more than we could cover today. I'd like to start the Q&A, and one question I have before we start, just because we do have a lot of Europeans in the audience, is it might be interesting to hear your views on how a Biden administration might impact the carbon and climate change in PJM, maybe beyond just this action on the part of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure that most of our listeners have followed the tense election battle between Biden and Trump, and what you will have heard as part of those discussions is that Biden is much stronger on battling climate change, that he's got much more ambitions in terms of reducing carbon emissions and fighting climate change. Whether he can put all of these ambitions into practice really depends on the power balance in the Senate. At the moment, it looks like the Democrats don't have the majority in the Senate, and the upcoming elections in Georgia are going to be crucial so these are for the Senate, to see whether the Democrats can have more power in the Senate. However, I would still expect that Biden would have to work across the aisles, and that some of that would have to be scaled back to bring Republicans on board. So the question remains, how much can the administration do? And also, if you think about whether the Biden administration can pick back up where the Obama administration left off in terms of introducing a federal carbon price, I think that is very uncertain, so it remains to be seen.
Yep, and I agree with your assessment, and I think it's interesting to point out that the reason RGGI exists, and as we said, it's a voluntary organization that states make the decision to join, is really because there has been an absence of any leadership on the federal level, and that's why states have joined institutions like RGGI. But it is likely we could see additional movement in both climate change policy and carbon. And so another question that kind of stems from your discussion of this kind of leakage and the split between East and West is, would PJM have to potentially adopt an RTO-wide carbon price, which would be probably compatible with RGGI, not instead, to avoid carbon leakage?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think what we've seen in the results that Filipe has presented is that really without the West committing to CO2 reductions, we don't see a reduction in overall CO2 emissions in PJM. So you would need something like a PJM-wide carbon pricing initiative to really get those emissions in the West under control. The question then is, how do you introduce that? And, would PJM have the powers to impose that? I don't think so. They would have to work on bringing those Western states on board. But then the question is whether states like Ohio, Illinois, and West Virginia and Kentucky would really be up for doing that. I mean, these are still very, very high fossil fuel emitters and with very large generation fleets, both gas and coal, with potentially not the political will to reduce those emissions. So yeah, it's again, it remains to be seen whether those can be brought on board to fight climate change and to reduce emissions and therefore to introduce carbon pricing potentially.
So that's a really important point that I also want to flag to the audience. So the FERC, who's the federal regulator, came out with an important policy statement just a month or two ago that said they do have the authority to consider if an RTO or ISO were to make a carbon proposal, that they have the authority to do it. And so that was an important point to just open the door. And so we haven't seen a proposal. And while PJM would be difficult for the very reason Ingolf just mentioned, in that you don't have all the states in alignment, what's interesting in the United States, the other part of RGGI, which is New England, you do have state alignment in this area, as well as New York, which is its own ISO. So what we might see in terms of a RTO or ISO carbon price may be coming from either New England or New York. So this is definitely an interesting space to watch, just like what would happen at the RTO level, potentially the federal level, and then at the state level. So I'm going to turn to our questions that people are asking, and feel free to continue to put some in. So someone is asking if you could share a high-level outlook on the impact of capacity and wholesale market prices. I don't think that was covered, and that's an important topic.
Of course, Ingolf, I'll take this one. Sure, good question. As expected by RGGI's carbon price, you'll be raising the average annual wholesale price level across the market. Thermal generators see an increase in their costs. They set the wholesale price the larger part of the year, and therefore annual average wholesale prices will rise. Now, regarding capacity prices, with higher energy wholesale prices overall, existing and new build power plants can capture a larger amount of the money from the day-ahead market and wholesale market, and so they will necessarily need less money from the capacity market. And so by 2040, we saw a significant reduction of the capacity prices compared against our original central. And I hope this clarified the question.
Yep, and I think one or two people had a question along those lines. Somebody else is asking, how would your results change if no additional interconnection was built? Ingolf?
Sure, and actually that's a very good question. When we developed this sensitivity, we took a step-by-step process. So we do have an understanding of that. And with the lack of interconnection, the situation that Filipe was describing earlier when he talked through the results of the case for gas getting better outside RGGI is not the case. So gas generators can't really export, or there's less capacity for them to export into RGGI, and therefore what we see is less investment in gas outside RGGI, which makes coal a bit more economic. So we see a bit more coal staying on the system. However, then if you look into RGGI, what the lack of interconnection does is it improves the investment case for solar PV. So we see a bit more solar PV built out, and it does the same for batteries as well. So they will then start providing more security of supply will be needed to fill that role, and we have a bit more battery build out if we don't have interconnection in RGGI states.
Okay, and here's one, Filipe, I'm not sure if you can answer. It's when do you expect to start seeing the impact of fewer gas builds given the process of joining RGGI? And so when you were doing the modeling, I know you pulled some 5-year results. I don't know if you have that in front of you. So is it still
Yes.
do you have a timeline?
So when we did the model, effectively the projects we removed were projects beyond the current capacity markets timeline, so beyond 23 hours, projects that were theoretically under planning but not in construction. In reality, that's what I would expect to happen. So current capacity market auctions go up to mid-2022. The next 4 capacity auctions will be done in the next 2 years. So this will give us some clarity regarding RGGI, and therefore new build will probably not show up on those capacity auctions and therefore not be built.
Okay. I am sensitive of the time, so I think I'm going to close the Q&A. If you have anything, please feel free to follow up with questions if you have any. And I will mention again that the link to the slide pack and the recording will come out as soon as possible. And as you can see, Ingolf and Filipe's contact information is on the screen. So as I said, please feel free to contact them. And then
yeah, we're more than happy to answer your questions anytime. So please feel free to contact us.
That's very approachable. And then also you see on the screen, we do weekly webinars, and our next webinar is on renewable energy developers in the Netherlands, time to invest in hydrogen. I think hydrogen is a very hot topic and certainly will continue to be one going into 2021. So we encourage you to sign up for that, where Netherlands is kind of being discussed as a case study of the issue. And in addition, we have come out with podcasts, and the series is called Fueling the Transition. And we have episode 3 out, which is on the power of renewables, delivering 2030 decarbonation targets. And that will be presented by Stephen Agnew, who's head of Renewables Northern Ireland. So you can both listen or subscribe to that at the URL listed below. And with that, I thank you all for attending and sticking out, and I hope you all learned something today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks for attending.